The hammer slipped from Nora Beckett's hand and clattered against the porch boards with a sound like a gunshot. And that was the moment Gideon Barnett's voice came from directly behind her, low and dangerous and utterly without warmth. "What in the hell do you think you are doing on my property?" Nora did not turn around. She had learned long ago that the best response to a threatening voice was to finish what you were doing before you acknowledged it, because the moment you flinched was the moment you lost. She pressed the flathead nail back into the gap between the loose board and the joist beneath it, set the hammer's face squarely, and drove it home with 3 clean strokes. Then she rose to her feet, brushed the sawdust from the knees of her brown work trousers, and turned to face the man who stood at the bottom of his own porch steps with his thumbs hooked into his gun belt and his jaw set like quarried stone. She had heard about Gideon Barnett before she ever laid eyes on him. Half of Redemption Creek spoke about him in careful, lowered voices. The other half did not speak about him at all, which told Nora considerably more. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than most men she had known, with dark hair pushed back beneath a sweat-darkened hat and eyes that were a peculiar shade of amber that caught the afternoon sun and turned it back at her like a warning. There was a jagged scar along the left side of his jaw that he had not bothered to hide, and several days of beard that suggested either he had been too busy or too indifferent to attend to it. He was, she thought with a flash of irritation she did not allow to reach her face, the most formidable-looking man she had encountered since coming west from Missouri, and he was also standing on a porch that had been quietly collapsing for months while everyone in town stepped around the problem and called it somebody else's business. "I am fixing your step," she said. "The loose board. Someone was going to break an ankle on it. I didn't ask anyone to fix my step." "No," Nora agreed pleasantly. "You didn't. You also haven't fixed it yourself, and it's been loose since before the first frost, according to Mrs. Calloway at the general store, which means it has been loose for at least 6 months. 6 months is long enough." Something moved behind his amber eyes. Not anger exactly. Something more complicated than anger, something with a dark past threaded through it that she did not yet have the map to read. "Get off my porch," he said. And Nora Beckett, who had ridden 300 miles across territory that could kill a person 6 different ways before breakfast to start a new life in this sun-blasted, beautiful, improbable town, picked up her hammer and her small wooden box of nails and stepped off his porch with her head high. But she stopped at the bottom of the steps beside him, close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw and the very deliberate way he was not looking at her, and she said in a voice pitched only for the two of them, "You've got a cracked railing post on the left side, a missing hinge on your window shutter, a gap in your door frame that's going to let in the winter cold like an open invitation, and the cross brace under the porch floor is split through. I noticed them while I was working on the step." She walked away. She did not look back, and she absolutely did not think about the way he had watched her go. She had been in Redemption Creek, Colorado territory, for exactly 43 days. The year was 1879, which meant the territory was still raw at its edges, in ways that the Eastern papers had not yet fully understood, still a place where a woman alone could be swallowed up entirely if she did not know how to make herself useful, and how to make herself visible at the same time. Nora knew how to do both. She had grown up the only daughter of a traveling carpenter in Missouri, learning that a hammer in a woman's hand was either a threat or a gift, depending entirely on whether you needed something built. Her father, Thomas Beckett, had died the previous winter of a fever that moved through their small town outside of St. Louis like a dark secret, touching this household and then that one, and leaving behind it a terrible quiet. Nora had nursed him for 3 weeks and buried him on a Tuesday and spent the following month settling his debts, which were more numerous than she had known, and then she had looked at the cold, gray February sky over Missouri and understood with perfect clarity that she was 27 years old, entirely alone, with skills that no one in her immediate vicinity particularly wanted from a woman, and that staying put was its own kind of surrender. She had read the notice in the St. Louis Dispatch about Redemption Creek while she was wrapping the last of her father's tools. A growing town in Colorado Territory, the notice said. Opportunities for tradespeople and skilled workers. The town was making an honest effort, which was more than some could claim. She had packed what she needed, sold what she could not carry, and bought a seat on the westbound stage. Redemption Creek turned out to be exactly what it had claimed to be in the notice, and nothing more than that, which was both honest and slightly underwhelming. It had a main street of packed dirt flanked by a dozen buildings of varying ambition, a church that doubled as a school on weekdays, a general store run by the formidable Agnes Calloway, who knew everything about everyone and was generous in sharing this knowledge with newcomers she approved of, a livery stable, a small hotel above the saloon, a doctor's office occupied by an elderly gentleman named Dr. Ambrose Finch, who smelled perpetually of tobacco and possessed, Nora gathered, an excellent reputation, and perhaps 40 families distributed across the surrounding range land. It also had, tucked at the edge of town where the main road bent south toward the river, a solitary house that had been letting itself go to ruin in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as though the man who lived in it had decided at some point that maintenance was an argument he no longer wished to make with the world. Agnes Calloway had given Nora the full account within the first week, in the comfortable no-nonsense way she had of presenting information as though it were simply the weather and not a person's history being laid out on her counter. Gideon Barnett had come to Redemption Creek 5 years ago, Agnes explained, arranging bolts of calico as she spoke. He had not come from anywhere that he chose to discuss, which in the West was sometimes wisdom and sometimes guilt, and occasionally both simultaneously. What was known? He was a capable man with horses. He had bought the house on the South Bend, and the 200 acres behind it fair and square from the widow Mathers who had been trying to sell since her husband's death. He kept to himself in the way that suggested the keeping was deliberate and not merely shy, and there had been a woman. What kind of a woman? Nora had asked, because with men who kept to themselves there was usually a woman at the origin of it. The kind that leaves, Agnes said simply. Eliza Holt. She came through 2 years ago with her brother, headed to Denver, stayed the winter, and somewhere in the staying she and Gideon Barnett found each other. Or found something, at any rate. By spring, she had changed her mind about Denver and married him, and they were settled in together. By the following autumn she had changed her mind about the marriage, and left on the southbound stage with a man named Wheeler who sold dry goods, and had considerably better prospects and considerably less silence about him. Nora had absorbed this, and he's been alone since, and deteriorating accordingly, Agnes confirmed, not in any dramatic way. He eats, he works his horses, he comes into town for supplies when he needs them, and conducts himself with perfect civility when he does. But that house, Miss Beckett, that house is quietly falling apart, and any man who lets his house fall apart around him is telling you something about the state of his interior. Nora had thought about that conversation a great deal over the following weeks. She had also walked past the house on the South Bend more than once, because her small rented room at the hotel gave her a reason to pass that way every morning on her route to the 3 properties where she had already secured work. A newly built family home whose owner had run out of cash before the finishing work was done. The church whose window frames needed recaulking before winter arrived in earnest, and the general store itself, where Agnes had several interior projects requiring skilled hands. She was building a reputation, slowly and carefully, and she was not in the business of other people's troubles, except for the step. The step had been bothering her since the first morning she walked past it and saw the board's corner lifting, the wood gone soft with weather and neglect, the nail heads rusting up through the grain. It was not a large problem. It was the kind of problem that took 20 minutes and a handful of nails and the willingness to simply do it. And every morning she walked past it and thought about those 20 minutes and that willingness, until one morning she found herself turning off the main road with her toolbox in hand, because the alternative was continuing to be the kind of person who walked past a problem they could solve. And she had decided at her father's graveside that she was done being that kind of person. She had not, it was true, fully accounted for the man who lived inside the house. She thought about him now, sitting in her small room above the saloon, with the late afternoon light coming through the single window and a cup of coffee cooling beside her. She thought about the scar on his jaw and the deliberate blankness he had used to cover whatever was actually moving behind his eyes. She thought about the 4 things she had told him: the cracked railing post, and the missing hinge and the gap in the door frame and the split cross brace. And she thought about the fact that she had said them not as a provocation, but as a simple statement of what she had seen, the way her father had always taught her to say what was true and let the truth decide what happened next. The truth had not yet decided anything, as far as she could tell, but she had the distinct and slightly alarming feeling that it was getting ready to. The following morning she went to the church and spent 3 hours reseating the window frames with fresh putty, and she did not walk past the house on the South Bend on her way home. This restraint lasted precisely until the next morning, when she went past it because there was no reasonable alternative route, and she was not going to rearrange her life to avoid a man who had simply been rude to her, even if she understood why he had been rude, and found that understanding more troubling than the rudeness itself. The step she had fixed was solid beneath her feet as she passed it on the road. She did not stop. She walked all the way to the church and then all the way back, and she was nearly past the South Bend again when she heard his voice. "Miss Beckett." She stopped. He was standing on his porch, which she noted with involuntary satisfaction was still firmly supported by the boards she had properly nailed down, with a cup in his hand and an expression she could not immediately classify. It was not the quarried stone expression from the day before. It was something more uncertain, which on a face constructed for certainty was considerably more interesting. "Mr. Barnett," she said, "the cracked railing post." He said it as though he were reporting a fact he had not previously considered relevant. "It's worse than it looks from the outside. The rot has gone down into the base." "It usually has," Nora said. "That's how rot works. You see a crack and you think it's a surface problem, and it isn't. I've been meaning to deal with it." "I don't doubt it." There was a silence. A meadowlark was singing somewhere in the direction of the river, bright and oblivious to the complicated atmospheric conditions developing on the South Bend Road. "I have the materials for the railing repair," he said finally. "Good cedar post cut last spring. I never got around to installing it." Nora studied him. He was studying a point slightly to the left of her face, which she recognized as the posture of a man who wanted to say something and was not yet certain what that something was. "I could take a look at it," she said carefully. "I'm not asking for charity. I know. I would charge you the standard rate for labor." He looked at her directly then, and there it was again, that amber intensity that made her think of a banked fire, something that had been deliberately contained but had not gone out. "Standard rate, 60 cents a day for general carpentry in a town this size is fair. You've been asking around." "I've been working," she corrected. "People talk while you work. It's one of the advantages of the trade. Where do you want to start? The railing post is structural priority. The door frame gap will matter more when the cold sets in. The hinge I can fix in under 20 minutes. He was quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he stepped back from the porch railing, a gesture that was either an invitation or a capitulation, and said, "The railing post, then. The way things are going, I'll put my hand through it by December." She took that as an invitation. The cedar post was in the small barn behind the house, exactly where he'd said it was, along with a collection of tools that were well made and well maintained, and told her something about the man that his silence had not. A man who cared for his tools cared about doing things properly, even when he was not doing them. It was the kind of detail her father had taught her to look for. Gideon carried the post out while she examined the existing installation, probing the base of the damaged post with a thin screwdriver to test the depth of the rot. It was thorough, as she had predicted. The wood was soft and gray almost to the base plate. "This needs to come completely out," she said. "You'll need a new base plate too. I have one." He disappeared back into the barn and returned with a cast iron bracket still in its paper wrapping. "Bought it 6 months ago." 6 months. She did not say anything about that. She took the bracket and examined it. "Good. This will work." They spent the morning in a particular kind of silence that was not uncomfortable. He held things when she asked him to hold them, and handed her tools before she had finished asking for them, which suggested either an intuitive understanding of carpentry process or the kind of attentiveness that came from watching closely. And she found herself increasingly curious about which it was. She was also, against her better judgment, beginning to notice other things. The careful way he handled the old wood as he removed it, not throwing it aside but setting it in a pile with a neatness that suggested respect for material even when it was beyond use. The quality of his hands, which were the hands of someone who worked, broad and scarred and competent. The fact that he had made coffee at some point without announcing it, and set a second cup on the porch railing within her reach without asking whether she wanted it, which she found both presumptuous and entirely correct. "What brought you to Redemption Creek?" he asked around mid-morning with the casualness of someone who had been constructing the question for some time. "Work," she said, "and the need for somewhere new." "From where?" "Missouri, St. Louis originally. My father was a carpenter. He died in January." The pause he left was exactly the right length, respectful without being excessive. "I'm sorry. He taught me everything I know about this trade," she said. "He had to teach someone. I was the only one available." She was aware of the slight defensiveness in those last two words and did not entirely conceal it. "Lucky for the available someone," he said, in a tone so dry it took her a moment to realize it was a compliment. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the new cedar post he was holding, his expression carefully neutral, and she found herself doing something she had not done in a very long time, which was suppressing a smile with genuine effort. The railing post took most of the morning and came out well, the new cedar straight and solid, the base plate seated properly, the whole assembly tested with the kind of firm pressure that would outlast several Colorado winters. Nora ran her hand down the smooth grain of the new wood and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing properly repaired. A satisfaction that was, she suspected, the closest she routinely came to something resembling happiness. "The window shutter next," she said. "The hinge is a simple replacement, 20 minutes. I said I would pay you for." "You will," she said, and pulled the new hinge from her tool box. She had brought it that morning from the supply Agnes kept in the back of the store, on the reasonable assumption that the conversation she had been thinking about would eventually lead here. He watched her work on the shutter hinge with the same focused attention he had given the railing post, and she became aware. In the specific way you become aware of things you have been trying not to notice, that being watched by Gideon Barnett was a different experience from being watched by most people. It was not the skeptical watching of someone waiting for her to make a mistake, which she had encountered often enough to recognize. It was something more serious than that, more genuine, as though he was actually interested in what he was seeing. "You're very good at this," he said. "Yes," she agreed without false modesty. "I am." That surprised him into a short, low sound that might have been a laugh. It was the first time she had heard anything from him that suggested amusement, and the sound of it did something complicated and unwelcome to her concentration. "Most people would say thank you and deflect," he observed. "My father said false modesty was the same as lying, just socially acceptable," she replied. He had very firm opinions about lying. She set the new hinge and tested the shutter's swing. Perfect. 2 down, 2 to go. The door frame was next, and this one required her to work in closer proximity to the house itself, to the interior spaces she had not yet entered, and she was aware of crossing some kind of threshold even before she physically crossed it. He opened the door and stepped back to let her through, and she entered Gideon Barnett's house for the first time with her eyes open and her attention carefully managed. It was clean, which surprised her slightly, and spare, which did not. There was a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove with good cast iron construction, a shelf of books that was the most unexpected thing in the room and which she noted with extreme interest, a braided rug on the floor whose colors had faded but whose construction was still sound, curtains at the windows that had been hung with care. The kitchen was visible through the back doorway, also clean, also spare. There was nothing ornamental except the books and a single framed photograph on the mantel that she deliberately did not look at directly. The gap in the door frame was on the left side, a crack running from about knee-height to the base, wide enough that she could feel the draft when she held her hand to it. She probed it, measured it, and went back to her tool box for the caulking and the thin strips of wood she would use to seat the repair properly. This was not an original fault, she said. The frame was well made. Something shifted. Did you have a hard winter last year? The second worst in 5 years, he said from behind her. The frost got under the foundation on the east side. I noticed it had shifted in the spring. And you didn't address it, she said, not accusing, just observing. I didn't, he agreed. She worked steadily and he stayed, which she had half expected him to leave and found herself glad he had not. They fell into the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people are occupied with a physical task, and the task provides cover for honesty. The kind of conversation that is harder to have when you are sitting across a table from someone with nothing between you. She learned that he had come from Texas originally, that he had worked horses his whole life, first as a ranch hand, then as a trainer for people who could afford good stock. That he had come to Colorado after a series of events he did not specify but which he described only as things that made it necessary to go somewhere new, and she heard in those words an echo of her own reason for coming west and did not press him. He learned that she had built her first piece of furniture at age 9, a small stool, and that it was still in use in a house in St. Louis, which was the particular kind of satisfaction that came from building things meant to last. That she had been engaged once to a young man named Arthur who had decided, fairly close to the date, that a woman who knew more about joinery than he did was not the domestic companion he had envisioned, and who had said so with more honesty than tact, and whom she had not, on reflection, been heartbroken about in the way she had expected. Why not heartbroken? Gideon asked. Because I think I already knew, she said. I think when you're with someone you belong with, you don't spend a significant portion of the relationship quietly afraid they'll figure out who you actually are. I spent the whole engagement being careful. I was so relieved when it ended that I knew the relief was telling me something important. She was not sure why she had told him that. She became aware of having told him that. She focused very deliberately on the caulking. The cross brace is the last one, she said after a moment. Under the porch floor. You'll need access from below. I know, I'll need a lamp. He brought one, a good oil lamp that burned cleanly, and he went under the porch with her because the access was tight, and the space below the boards was the kind of dark that was not merely an absence of light, but felt actively indifferent to your comfort. She found the split crossbrace immediately. It was significant, a diagonal board that ran from the central pier to the outer joist, cracked almost through, the wood dried and stressed to the breaking point. This has been getting worse for a long time, she said, her voice slightly muffled by the close space. I know, he said. He was crouched beside her with the lamp, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool underground air. I noticed it in the spring. You've been meaning to fix a great deal of things for a considerable amount of time, she said carefully. Yes, he said, I have. There was something in the way he said it that made her look at him. In the lamplight his face was all shadow and amber, the scar along his jaw more visible, his eyes very serious and very close. She understood, in the sudden way that understanding sometimes arrived, that they were not talking entirely about the cross brace. What stopped you? She asked, her voice quiet. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then he said, I stopped caring about the house for a while. When you stop caring about your house, you stop caring about a lot of things. It's easier than it sounds to let everything just stay the way it is. And then someone comes along and fixes your step without asking, she said. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held very carefully in a neutral position for a long time began very slightly to release. And then someone does that, he agreed, and you find out you're angry about it. Were you? Briefly, he said, and then I wasn't. She held his gaze in the lamplight for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she said, "Hand me the saw. I need to cut the replacement piece." He handed her the saw. They were under that porch for 45 minutes, and when they came out into the afternoon light and Nora stood and brushed the dirt from her clothes and looked at the porch above her, solid now, all four things addressed, she felt the particular completeness that came from a job genuinely finished. Gideon stood beside her and looked at the same porch. "It's the most work that's been done on this house in 2 years," he said. "It shows," she said, not unkindly. He turned to look at her, and the afternoon sun was in his eyes, turning them that particular warm amber that she had been trying not to find significant, and he said, in a different voice than any he had used before, quieter and more careful, "Will you stay for supper, Miss Beckett?" She should have said no. She was well aware she should have said no. She said, "That depends on what you're making." "I can make biscuits," he said, "and I have a rabbit from this morning." "That will do," she said. That was the beginning. She did not stay late that first evening, because she was a woman alone in a small town, and the mechanics of reputation mattered more in small towns than anywhere else. But she stayed long enough to eat the biscuits, which were better than she had expected, and the rabbit stew, which was considerably better than that, and to discover that Gideon Barnett, when he was sitting at his own table in his own house that had been mostly repaired that afternoon, was a different kind of quiet than the closed, warning quiet he had been on the porch. This quiet had room in it. He asked about her father, and she found herself talking about him with an ease she had not managed with anyone else since his death, about the smell of sawdust in the morning, and the specific vocabulary of the trade, and the way her father had always told her that anything worth building was worth building twice in your head before you touched it with your hands. He listened in the way that people listen when they are actually listening and not simply waiting for their turn to speak, and she found herself watching his face for the things he did not say, which were as informative as the things he did. He had a dark past, she was increasingly certain. Not in the sense of violence or crime, but in the sense of loss accumulated and not entirely survived, the way some winters were not entirely survived, but left behind a damage that persisted into the spring. She did not know the shape of it yet. She only knew it was there. She left before dark and said good evening at the gate, and he said good evening from the porch, and she was 3 houses down the South Bend Road before she acknowledged to herself that she was going to come back. She came back the next day, ostensibly because she had left a small chisel under the porch during the cross-brace repair, which was true. She came back the day after that because Agnes mentioned that the supply of the specific cedar nails Gideon would need for the remaining small repairs had arrived, and he would need them, which was also true. She came back the day after that because she walked past and he was on the porch and the morning was cold and clear, and he raised his coffee cup at her in a gesture that was as close to an invitation as she suspected he knew how to make. These visits accumulated. They accumulated over 2 weeks into a pattern that Redemption Creek noticed with the attentive interest that small towns bring to such things, and that Agnes Calloway tracked with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had been hoping for exactly this development since Nora walked through her door. "He came into the store yesterday," Agnes told Nora, on a bright October morning, while Nora was working on the final trim piece of the general store's new storage shelves. "Bought cedar oil for the new porch posts. Hadn't bought anything for that house in over a year. He's becoming more attentive to maintenance," Nora said neutrally. "He asked whether you preferred coffee or tea," Agnes said. Nora set down her plane very slowly. "Did he?" "He did. I told him coffee from what I'd observed. He didn't say why he was asking." "I don't know why he was asking either," Nora said, which was not entirely true. She thought about the question all the way back to her room that afternoon, and she thought about the evening 2 days ago when she had stayed for supper again, and they had talked, genuinely talked. In the long, unhurried way, she had not talked with anyone in longer than she could easily calculate, about Texas and Missouri, and what the difference was between a place you came from and a place you belonged to. He had said he was not sure he had ever found a place he belonged to, and she had said she was starting to think belonging to a place was less important than she had been raised to believe, that maybe what mattered was belonging to the work you did and the people you chose. He had looked at her across the table when she said that with an expression she was increasingly certain was the nearest he came to showing what he was actually feeling, something stripped of the careful blankness, something that had to do with being seen. She was also thinking about what Agnes had told her 3 days ago, in a lower voice, the part of the account she had not delivered on first introduction. There was more to the story of Eliza Holt's departure than simply a woman changing her mind about a man. There had been, Agnes said carefully, a child that had not survived past its first month, the previous spring, 3 months before Eliza left. Gideon had come through it in the silent way he came through everything, but the grief had settled into him like cold into a foundation, working its damage from below. Nora had gone very still when Agnes told her this. She had understood, immediately and completely, what she was hearing, not just the fact of it but the shape of the damage it had made, and she understood suddenly why he had let the house fall apart, why 6 months of meaning to repair things had not translated into actually repairing them. Some griefs were too large to coexist with the ordinary maintenance of life, and this was that kind of grief, and it had not been the kind of grief you could share with a town that meant well but did not know how to hold it. She thought about whether to say anything about it. She thought about it for 3 days before she decided that she would not bring it up directly, because some things were not hers to open, but that she would create the conditions in which it might open on its own if it needed to, which was different. She went to his house on a Thursday afternoon when she had no other work, carrying a jar of Agnes's apple butter that Agnes had specifically pressed on her for the purpose. And she knocked and waited, and he opened the door with his hat pushed back, and a streak of what appeared to be axle grease along his forearm, and an expression of mild startlement that settled quickly into something quieter and more welcoming. "I wasn't expecting you today," he said. "Agnes sent apple butter," she said, "and I have no other work this afternoon. I thought I might look at that warped cabinet door I noticed in your kitchen. It needs a plane in 20 minutes. "You've been cataloging the house," he said. There was no accusation in it. "Occupational habit," she said. "I walk into a space and I see what needs attention. I can stop if you prefer." He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. She fixed the cabinet door while he watched from the doorway. Then he made coffee, because he had apparently taken Agnes's information to heart, and they sat at the kitchen table with the afternoon sun coming through the window and the new door swinging cleanly on its hinges. And the conversation moved the way conversations moved between them now, with a naturalness that still surprised her given how difficult and contained he had seemed on that first day. He told her, partway through the second cup of coffee, without preamble and with his eyes on the table, about the child. About the 7 months of waiting and the month of having and the particular devastation of the loss, and then the particular devastation of Eliza's departure, which had been less surprising but no less final. He told it in the careful, quiet voice of someone who has not said the thing aloud in a long time, testing the weight of each word before setting it down. Nora listened. She did not reach for platitudes or consolation. When he finished, she said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. It was a terrible thing to carry alone. I've been carrying it alone because I let everyone here believe the only part of the story was Eliza leaving," he said. "It seemed simpler." "Simpler than being known," she said. He looked up from the table at that and she held his gaze without flinching. "Yes," he said. "It is simpler," she said, "but simpler and better are not the same thing. I've noticed that often." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "I noticed that you noticed the 4 things wrong with the house before you'd spent more than 20 minutes on it. That's my training. I noticed you came back anyway, after I told you to get off my property." I had a chisel to retrieve. "Miss Beckett." "Nora," she said, "I think we're past Miss Beckett." Something shifted in his face again, that same careful release she had seen under the porch. "Nora," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded different than it did anywhere else, like it was made of different material. "Why did you come back?" She considered the honest answer. The honest answer was complicated and she was not entirely sure she had all of its pieces, but she knew the main piece, and she said it because her father had been very firm about honesty. "Because you were interesting. Because you were hurting and you were trying very hard to make it look like something else, and you weren't entirely succeeding, and I found that more interesting than the performance. And because the house needed attention and I couldn't stop thinking about it." "Which mattered more?" he asked. "The house or the man in it?" She looked at him steadily. "They seem to be the same project," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something she had not seen him do before, not fully, not aimed at her directly. He smiled. It was not a large smile, nothing showy, but it reached his eyes, reached that amber warmth she had been telling herself not to read into. And it was the most undefended expression she had seen on his face, and it did something to her chest that she recognized as the beginning of serious trouble. She stood up and gathered her tools and said good afternoon before anything else could happen, and walked back to her room above the saloon and sat on the edge of her bed and thought, very carefully, about what she was doing. She was a woman of 27 who had come to the West for independence and work, not for complications. She was building a business in a town that was beginning to value her. She was establishing herself on her own terms, and she was not going to make the same mistake Arthur had almost made her make, the mistake of submerging who she was for the sake of someone else's comfort. She was very clear about all of this. She also knew, with the same certainty with which she could look at a piece of wood and know where the stress would crack it, that she was already in considerably deeper than she had intended to go. The following Sunday, Gideon came to the church service. This was not, Agnes informed her afterward with barely contained satisfaction, something he had done in at least a year and a half. He sat 3 rows behind her, and she was aware of him the entire service with the specific awareness of a compass needle that has found north and cannot convincingly pretend otherwise. He fell into step beside her on the way out naturally, as though this had always been the arrangement, and they walked down the main street in the Sunday morning light with the town going about its post-service business around them, and she found herself thinking that this was pleasant in a way that seemed to require no particular justification. "I have a proposal," he said. She looked at him. "I have a barn with 3 horses that I've been training for a client in Durango," he said. "The client is coming to collect them next month. The horses are ready, but the barn needs work before I bring in the next lot. Roof repair, new stall boards on the south side, some drainage issues I've been ignoring. I was thinking I could hire you for the work and we could call it a legitimate business arrangement." "It is a legitimate business arrangement," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is also an excuse to see you every day without either of us having to acknowledge that." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what you're going to say. That you came here for your own reasons and your own work and you're not looking for complications. I know that. I'm not offering complications. What are you offering?" He was quiet for a moment, looking down the sun-bright main street of Redemption Creek with an expression she was learning to read, the expression that meant he was choosing words with unusual care. "I'm offering honesty," he said finally. "I told you things 2 days ago that I haven't told another person in this town. I don't know entirely what that means. I only know that when you're not there the house feels very much like what it was 6 months ago, and when you are there it doesn't, and I would like to understand that better if you're willing." She looked at him. The October light was turning his hair dark gold and throwing the sharp angles of his jaw into relief, and there was something so deliberately stripped of pretense in what he had just said, something so absolutely without the kind of maneuvering she had come to expect from men who wanted something, that she felt the last careful distance she had been maintaining begin to close. "I'll look at your barn," she said. Monday morning. The barn project took 3 weeks and was the most important 3 weeks of Nora Beckett's life, though she did not fully recognize this until somewhat later. They worked side by side every morning in the barn's good timber smell, which was horses and hay and seasoned wood, with the Colorado autumn brilliant and cold outside the open barn doors. He learned her methods and anticipated them. She learned his rhythms and worked alongside them. They talked, they were silent, they argued cheerfully about the best approach to the drainage problem, and she was right, and he conceded this with a directness she found enormously appealing. She met his horses properly, 3 young quarter horses with names he had given them that reflected a dry humor she was discovering in him, patience, principle, and argument, and she understood from the way he handled them, with an absolute steadiness and a patience that was not passive but active, that this was the truest version of him, this man with horses. He cooked supper for her 3 times during those weeks, and once she cooked for him in his kitchen, making a bean soup her father had taught her that was better than it sounded, and he ate 2 bowls of it and said so, and she thought this small thing was one of the most comfortable moments she had experienced in years. On the second Friday of the barn project, when the roof was done and the stall boards were in place and they were addressing the drainage, he came up beside her where she was surveying the south wall and said quietly, "I need to tell you something." She straightened. His tone had changed. "The client in Durango, the man who's coming for the horses, his name is Ray Wheeler." She took a moment to place it. When she did, she understood. "Eliza's Ray Wheeler." "Yes, I didn't know when I took the commission. Found out 2 weeks ago when the letter came with his full name. By then the horses were too far into training to return, and the money is owed, and I keep my word on business." She watched him. "Does he know whose horses they are?" "He knows they're mine. We've corresponded only by letter. I don't know if he knows I know who he is." "And Eliza?" "I don't know," he said. "I don't know if she'll come with him. I haven't known how to think about it." Nora was quiet for a moment, looking at the south wall, at the good new timber she had laid to replace the rotted stall boards. "Are you afraid of what you'll feel," she asked, "when you see them?" He was quiet for long enough that she knew this was the true question, and he was taking it seriously. "I don't know," he said. 6 months ago I knew I was still angry. 3 weeks ago I thought I had gotten past most of it. Now I don't know what I am." She looked at him. "Do you want me there?" He looked at her with an expression of such sudden, unguarded relief that it cost her something to look at it directly. "Yes," he said. "Then I'll be there," she said. Ray Wheeler came on a Wednesday, 3 days before the end of October, in a wagon with 2 other men to help with the horses. He was a compact, good-looking man in his mid-30s with a salesman's easy manner and an eye that was accustomed to evaluating things quickly for their value. He came alone, which answered one question. Eliza was not with him. Nora was in the barn when the wagon arrived, doing the final checks on the stall hardware. She heard voices in the yard and then heard Gideon's voice, steady and absolutely level, conducting the transaction with perfect professionalism. She stayed where she was and listened to the sounds of a business being completed, the inspection of the horses, the agreement on price, the counting of money. When Wheeler's wagon rolled out of the yard with patience, principle, and argument tied behind it, Nora came out of the barn to find Gideon standing in the yard with his back to her, watching the wagon go. She walked up and stood beside him. "Well," he said. "How do you feel?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Older," he said, "and less angry than I expected." She considered this. "That's probably healthy. I kept thinking I'd have something to say to him," he said. "Some speech, something, and I had nothing. He was just a man buying horses." "He was," she said. "That's all he was." He turned then, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, something more open than anything he had shown her, something close to uncomplicated relief, the relief of a man who has been carrying a weight and set it down and found the setting down less dramatic than anticipated. And then he looked at her standing there in the October yard in her work clothes with her hair escaping its braid in the wind, and the expression shifted into something else entirely. "Nora," he said. "Gideon," she said carefully. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you're willing. I understand you came here for your own work and your own life, and I'm not asking you to change any of that. I'm asking to be part of it if you'll let me, in whatever form that takes." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass of the yard, and somewhere in the barn the newest horse he had acquired, a rangy bay gelding he had not yet named, knocked against his stall door with easy impatience. "I will," she said, "with the understanding that I keep my business and my independence." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said. "And with the understanding that if you find 4 more things wrong with the house, you tell me about them instead of letting them go another 6 months." He made that sound again, the low one that was a laugh, richer and more certain than the first time she had heard it, and said, "I'll tell you the moment I notice them." She held out her hand, and he took it, both of them aware of the oddity and the rightness of sealing this particular agreement in this particular way, with a handshake that was also the opposite of a handshake, that was the beginning of something neither of them had exact words for yet. Redemption Creek took the courtship in stride, with the slightly smug air of a town that had been quietly hoping for something like this, and was pleased to have been proven correct in its hopes. Agnes Calloway received the news of the formal courtship with a satisfaction she did not bother to conceal, and immediately ordered an additional stock of cedar oil on the store's account, which was her way of expressing confidence in the long-term outcome. The courtship was the kind that suited both of them, which meant it was conducted largely in the course of doing things rather than the performative social rituals that neither of them had much patience for. He took her to the river on a Sunday afternoon and showed her where the best timber grew, the cottonwoods along the bend and the scrub oak on the hillside, explaining the land with the easy fluency of someone who had learned its language. She showed him the finishing work she was doing on the family home at the north end of town, the careful detail work in the window surrounds, and he looked at it with a genuine appreciation that was not the polished approval of someone trying to impress, but the honest interest of someone who understood craftsmanship. He brought her wildflowers once, badly bundled, apologetic in a way that was clearly unfamiliar to him, and she put them in a tin cup on her windowsill and did not make anything significant of it out loud, though she thought about them privately at some length. She told him about Arthur one evening, the full account, not the abbreviated version she had given under the porch, the years of careful management, the relief at the ending, the understanding she had arrived at afterward that she needed someone who would not be diminished by what she was. He listened and said, "Arthur sounds like an idiot," in the dry, certain way that made her laugh, genuinely laugh, the way she had not laughed with anyone in years. He told her more about Texas, the ranch where he had worked as a young man, the mentor who had taught him everything about horses, a man named Samuel Cross who had been both generous and demanding in equal measure, and who had died of a heart attack when Gideon was 22, and left him his best breeding stallion, and the knowledge of what it meant to take a thing seriously. He told her about the events that had brought him north, which turned out to be less dramatic than she had imagined and more complicated. The collapse of the Texas ranch in the cattle crisis of the mid-70s, the subsequent years of moving through a series of jobs in New Mexico and Kansas, before landing in Colorado with enough saved to buy the Mathers property and make something that could reasonably be called a start. He did not tell her, until the second month of the courtship, the part about his brother. The brother's name was Daniel, and he had been the other half of Gideon's world from childhood through young manhood, and he had been killed in Abilene, Kansas, in 1875, in a dispute over a card game that Daniel had not started and could not walk away from because of the particular rigidity of the frontier's honor codes and the particular bad judgment of the man across the table from him. Gideon had not been in Abilene. He had been 2 days' ride away working horses. He had come for the funeral and buried his brother and done what he had to do about the man responsible, which he described with deliberate brevity, and which she understood was a line he was drawing not from dishonesty, but from the knowledge that some acts exist outside the ordinary vocabulary of justification. After that, she understood the rest of it more clearly. The deliberate aloneness, the house let go to ruin, the care lavished on horses instead of people, the particular quality of his grief, all of it made a complete picture that was terrible and comprehensible and, in its way, a story that had been waiting for its ending. "You've been waiting to stop," she said. "Waiting to stop what? Being only with yourself," she said. "You've been self-sufficient for so long that you've almost forgotten it's a choice and not a condition." He looked at her with the amber eyes that she had stopped trying not to find significant weeks ago. "You make it sound very straightforward," he said. "It is straightforward," she said. "From the outside, most things are. From the inside it looks like survival." "I know," she said. "Survival looks like walls and walls look like safety, and they are for a while. But they're also the thing that keeps everything else out." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have not wanted anyone in 3 years. Not really wanted. Not in the way that matters." She held very still. "I want you," he said, "in the way that matters. I want you in my house and in my mourning and in whatever I build from here. I want you telling me what's broken and what can be fixed and what needs replacing entirely. I want the version of me that exists when you're in the room, which is apparently the version that eats 2 bowls of bean soup and laughs at things and lets someone else hold the lamp." She felt her throat tighten in the particular way that happened when something true arrived without warning. She swallowed it down and said, in a voice that was perhaps not entirely steady, "That's a very thorough statement." "I've been thinking about it for several weeks," he said. "I wanted to get it right." She stood up from the chair she had been sitting in his kitchen where she had eaten supper again, and walked around the table to where he was sitting, and put her hands on either side of his face, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep, and kissed him for the first time, and felt him still entirely for one moment, and then respond with the same seriousness and the same care that he brought to everything he did. And she thought this was, against all her careful planning, the most exactly right thing that had happened to her in years. Winter came to Redemption Creek with the full conviction of a Colorado winter, which was a different proposition entirely from Missouri winters, a deep and unrelenting cold that settled into the valley in November and stayed until March. The repairs to Gideon's house held. The caulking in the door frame stood firm against the draft. The railing posts were steady. The porch was solid. He found 2 more things that needed attention, a loose chimney flashing and a gap in the kitchen floor, and he told her about them immediately, which made her smile every time she thought about it, which was more often than she chose to acknowledge. She moved into the house in December, not in the dramatic or scandalous way that would have made life in Redemption Creek considerably more complicated, but in the way that was available to them in 1879 in a small Colorado town, which was the way of standing in front of the Reverend Aldous Pierce in the Redemption Creek Church on a December Saturday with Agnes Calloway and the Finch family and several of the neighboring ranchers in attendance, and saying the words that made it official and permanent and a matter of public record. Gideon Barnett got through his vows with more fluency than she had expected, delivering them in a clear, steady voice that did not waver, which she attributed to the weeks of thinking things through that she had learned was his method. When the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with such unhurried certainty that Agnes Calloway made a soft sound that was entirely unlike her usual composure and had to look at the ceiling for a moment. They walked back to the house on the south bend through December cold that turned their breath to smoke, and Gideon carried her over the threshold of his house, which was now their house, solid under his feet, all the boards and braces and frames repaired and holding, and set her down inside where the wood stove was radiating good heat and said, "I need to tell you about 3 more things I noticed in the kitchen." She burst out laughing, genuinely and completely, and he pulled her close in the warm kitchen and laughed with her, which was the best sound she had heard in the entire year. Winter passed and spring arrived with the violence of Colorado Springs, the snowmelt and the mud, and the first astonishing green pushing up through the last of the cold. Nora's work expanded. She had by this point established a genuine reputation in Redemption Creek and the surrounding settlements as the carpenter who did things properly and charged fairly, and commissions were coming in with increasing frequency. A storage building for one ranch, a new room addition on the schoolhouse, the renovation of the saloon's interior, which was both her most challenging and her most lucrative project to date. She kept her business in her own name, Nora Beckett Carpentry, because she had built the name and the reputation and it was hers, and Gideon had said without hesitation that this was right and sensible, which confirmed for her that her judgment about him had been correct from the beginning. He asked about her work the way she asked about his horses, with genuine interest and the occasional useful question, and she found that working next to someone who understood work, not her specific work but the nature of work itself, was a different experience from the solitude she had grown accustomed to and one she was prepared to prefer. The partnership between them was not without its difficulties. He was a man who had been alone a long time and alone in a particular way, and there were mornings when the old distance came back into him like weather, when he retreated into the sparse silence of his pre-Nora existence, and she had to resist the impulse to crowd him back out of it. She had learned over the winter months that the correct response to these mornings was not to push but to be present, to continue her own work in the same space, to let him come back in his own time, which he always did. She also had her own difficulties, the ones she had brought with her from Missouri, the reflexive independence that sometimes tipped into refusal to accept help, the habit of managing everything herself that had been an asset for years and occasionally became, in the context of a marriage, a form of keeping distance. He called her on this with the same directness she had always appreciated in him. Once, after she had spent 3 days managing a problem with a difficult client without mentioning it, and his point had been fair and she had said so, and they had argued about it productively for 20 minutes and reached a better arrangement afterward. In April, she told him she was going to have a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning while they were both in the kitchen, he with his coffee and she with her tea, which she had switched to in February when coffee began to seem less appealing, and she said it plainly and directly, the way she said most things, and watched his face. He went very still. The amber eyes went to some interior distance and then came back to her with a very careful intensity, and she could see him holding 2 things simultaneously, the joy that was trying to arrive and the fear that was trying to arrive alongside it, the knowledge of what had happened before, the shadow of the grief that had never fully resolved itself. She reached across the table and took his hand and held it and said, "We are going to be careful. Dr. Finch has delivered more babies in this territory than he can count, and he is very good at his work. And I am going to need you to let yourself feel good about this, because I need that from you. I cannot do this with only myself feeling good about it." He turned his hand over and held hers properly, her carpenter's hand in his horseman's hand, and said, "I'm going to feel terrified about it every day." "Yes," she said, "and good about it too." "And good about it too," he agreed. He took extraordinary care of her in the ways that were practical and useful rather than the ways that were merely protective and would have driven her to distraction. He did not suggest she stop working, because he understood that stopping work was not something she was capable of without considerable damage to her interior state. He did ensure that she ate properly and slept adequately, and that Dr. Finch was consulted at appropriate intervals. He repaired 2 additional things in the house without being asked, which she suspected was his way of processing anxiety, and she let him do it because the chimney flue and the cellar door had both genuinely needed attention. They talked about the child in the way they talked about most things, honestly, and with the kind of humor that was not a deflection, but a way of holding difficult things at a manageable angle. He was going to teach the child about horses, he said, whatever kind of child it turned out to be. She was going to teach the child about wood, about the difference between wood that would bear weight and wood that wouldn't, about how to tell from the grain which way the stress would run. She was going to teach the child what her father had taught her, that anything worth building was worth building twice in your head before you touched it with your hands. On a night in late November, with Redemption Creek deep in its second winter, and the snow laying thick and quiet outside the windows, Nora's son was born in their bedroom with Dr. Finch in attendance and Agnes Calloway present, because Agnes had made clear that her presence was not a request but a decision, and Nora had found she was profoundly glad of it. The birth was not easy and it was not quick, and there were hours in the middle of it when Gideon stood on the other side of the bedroom door in the posture of a man who is doing the hardest thing he has ever done, which was being unable to do anything. Agnes came out twice to report progress, and he asked the right questions and accepted the answers without catastrophizing, which Nora, between the necessary and demanding work of the business at hand, was told about afterward and found she loved him more for it. The boy arrived in the hour before dawn, at full volume and with complete commitment to making his presence known, and Dr. Finch placed him in Gideon's arms while Nora was being attended to. And Gideon stood with his son in the lamplight of their bedroom, and Nora watched his face from the bed and saw something there that she had no words for, something that was the resolution of a grief and the arrival of a future simultaneously, and she felt her own throat close with the weight of it. "He's all right?" she asked. "He's perfect," Gideon said. "He's absolutely perfect." "He's very loud," Nora observed. "Yes," Gideon agreed, and his voice had something in it that was so close to joy that Nora let herself stop being careful about the word joy and simply felt it. They named the boy Samuel Thomas, for Samuel Cross, the horseman who had shaped Gideon, and Thomas Beckett, the carpenter who had shaped Nora, and he proved to be, in the way of infants who arrive at full volume, an opinion-having person from the very beginning, which Nora found deeply satisfying as evidence of character. The months that followed were the fullest of Nora's life, full in the sense of genuinely occupied, every part of her days engaged with something real. Samuel grew with the cheerful urgency of a healthy child, and turned the house on the South Bend from the spare, careful space it had been into something noisier and more complicated and considerably more alive. Gideon was a father with the same absolute steadiness he brought to horses and to the slow business of opening himself to another person, unhurried and certain, and Nora watched him with Samuel and thought that this was what all that patience had been for, not for bearing solitude but for giving to someone who needed it completely. She returned to work when Samuel was 3 months old, starting with the smaller projects and building back up, and Gideon adjusted his schedule around hers with the practical flexibility of someone who was choosing this arrangement rather than tolerating it, which made all the difference. Agnes Calloway, who had apparently appointed herself the guardian of the household's functional well-being, stopped in twice a week with reliable cheerfulness, and occasionally took Samuel for an afternoon so that both his parents could work uninterrupted, doing this with the specific efficiency of a woman who was deeply invested in the outcome. The spring of 1881 brought Redemption Creek 3 new families, a new contract for Nora to build the additional rooms to accommodate a schoolhouse that had outgrown itself, and a letter for Gideon from Texas that took a week to arrive at any resolution. The letter was from a surviving cousin he had not seen in 12 years, A man named James Barnett who was alive and apparently in reasonable health and interested in correspondence. Having heard, through the diffused networks of frontier communication, that Gideon was in Colorado and had a family. Gideon read the letter twice and put it on the kitchen table and did not touch it for 2 days, and Nora left it there without mentioning it. On the third day he picked it up and she watched him from the window, and he looked up and found her watching and said, "I'm going to write back." "Good," she said. "He's family. He doesn't know anything about me except that I exist." "Then you'll have a great deal to tell him," she said. "Start with Samuel. People who haven't seen you in 12 years need something concrete." He wrote the letter. It was the beginning of a correspondence that eventually brought James Barnett to Redemption Creek on a June afternoon 2 years later, a weather-beaten man of 40 with Gideon's coloring and a warmth that was entirely his own, who walked into the house on the South Bend and shook Gideon's hand and looked at Samuel with an expression of evident pleasure and said to Nora, on the strength of everything he had been written about her, "He told me you fixed his step without asking." I said that was either the bravest thing or the most foolhardy thing I'd ever heard. "It was somewhat both," Nora said, and gave him coffee and a plate of biscuits. By the summer of 1882, Nora's business had grown to the point where she needed help, and she took on a young man named Eli Franks, newly arrived from Kansas with a solid foundation in general carpentry and a willingness to learn, who was 17 and genuinely skilled, and who she trained the way her father had trained her, with patience and high standards and the expectation that he would eventually exceed his teacher. He did within 3 years, which was exactly what she had hoped for. She and Gideon talked about the future on warm evenings, sitting on the porch that she had first fixed on an autumn morning 3 years ago, Samuel between them or inside sleeping, the mountains going purple in the distance, and the town lights beginning to show in the blue dusk. They talked about the additional room they were going to build on the east side of the house, which Nora had been designing in her head for 6 months. They talked about the additional horses Gideon was acquiring, and the partnerships he was building with ranchers in the Southern Valley who needed quality trained stock. They talked about whether Samuel was going to take after his mother's silence or his father's volume, which appeared to be inverting the obvious expectations, as Samuel was a notably talkative child with strong aesthetic opinions about everything in his immediate environment, and a particular devotion to his father's horses that suggested the two inheritances had found their own synthesis. In the autumn of 1883, when Samuel was almost 2 years old, Nora told Gideon about the second child. He took this news with considerably more of the joy and considerably less of the fear, which she had expected, and which was still wonderful to see. He put his arms around her in the kitchen where she had told him, because this seemed to be the natural location for important news in their household, and held her for a long moment, and she felt against her his heartbeat, steady and particular, and thought about all the boards and braces and frames they had fixed together, and all the ones still to come, and all the ways a life built with attention to what was broken and willingness to repair it was the finest kind of life available. "Are you hoping for anything specific?" she asked into the fabric of his shirt. "Healthy," he said. "That's all I want." "That's all I want too," she said. "But if you have a preference between the two obvious options." "A girl," he said without hesitation. "Samuel needs someone who will argue with him," she laughed. "You think a daughter will argue with him more than a son would. I think our daughter will argue with everyone," he said. "Constitutionally, she'll take after her mother." "Is that a criticism?" "It is absolutely the finest thing I can imagine," he said. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1884, which was a spring so dramatically alive and green that even Dr. Finch, who had been in Colorado long enough to be somewhat philosophical about the seasons, remarked on it. She arrived with the same conviction as her brother, but quieter about it, with a stillness that seemed, from the very beginning, to be its own kind of authority. They named her Lillian Rose, the Lillian for no particular person but simply because it suited her, and the rose for the wild roses that were, that very week, coming into bloom along the south fence of the property. Gideon held Lillian the way he had held Samuel, with absolute care and an expression that undid Nora every time she looked at it. But there was something additional in it now, something that was not present in the terror and wonder of the first time, something that was the accumulated security of having done this before and survived it, of having built something that was holding. He looked down at his daughter and he looked up at Nora, and he said, very quietly, "Thank you." She knew he meant more than the immediate circumstance. She knew he meant all of it, from the nail she had driven into his loose board on an October morning when she had no particular right to be on his porch, to this room and this bed, and this small, certain face looking up at him from the blanket. "Thank you," she said back. Redemption Creek in the autumn of 1884 was a different town from the one she had arrived in 5 years ago. Not dramatically transformed, but steadily improved in the way of places that have good roots and decent leadership, and enough people who care about the difference between good and acceptable. The schoolhouse was twice its original size. There was a proper doctor's office with a second room for longer-term care, Dr. Finch having finally admitted that his practice had outgrown his single room. The saloon had Nora's best interior work on its walls and ceiling, which she found somewhat ironic and completely acceptable. There were new families on the surrounding land, new names becoming familiar, new children becoming friends with Samuel. Nora's business now employed Eli Franks full-time and had recently taken on a second apprentice, a young woman named Mary Oakes whose father had been a carpenter in Ohio, and who had arrived in town with demonstrably better foundational skills than most of the men Nora had interviewed. Nora had hired her on the same day she walked in, because her father had believed in teaching what you knew to whoever wanted to learn it, and she had always held that to be true. She and Gideon sat on the porch on a Saturday evening in October, the same month of their 5th anniversary of the day she had walked off their property with her tool box and told him about the 4 things. Samuel was inside, 5 years old and engaged with the elaborate wooden fortress Nora had built him over the summer, populated with small carved horses that Gideon had made over several evenings with a penknife, and the patience of someone who believed that small things done with care were not small things. Lillian was in her father's arms, 7 months old and conducting a thorough investigation of the button on his shirt pocket. The evening star was coming up over the mountains and the air had the clean, cold edge that meant Colorado was beginning to remember what it was, and the porch was solid under their feet, all its boards properly seated, the railing firm, the posts straight, the crossbrace below renewed and holding against whatever winters came. "I walked past this house on my first morning in town," Nora said, "before we'd met." "I know," he said. "Agnes told me. She told me about you before you'd been here a week." Nora looked at him. What did she say? That a woman had come to town who knew what she was doing and wasn't apologizing for it, he said. And that someone was going to have to figure that out fairly quickly or let a good thing go past. She never mentioned that she told you. Agnes operates on a need-to-know basis, he said. You needed to know that she approved of you. I needed to know you existed. Different information. Nora shook her head slowly, deeply unsurprised. That woman, she said. She's never wrong, he said. I'll grant her that. Lillian released the button and made a decisive sound, the sound of a person who has arrived at a conclusion. Nora reached over and took her daughter's small hand, and Lillian grasped her finger with the unthinking certainty of the very young, and Nora felt the whole evening, the mountains and the cold air and the lamplight coming through the window behind them and the man beside her, as a single coherent thing, complete and solid and genuinely hers. The East Room addition, she said. I've finalized the plans. I want to start the framing before the first hard frost. I know, he said. I found another thing. She looked at him. The kitchen ceiling, he said. There's a beam that's been flexing. You can see it in the plaster line. I noticed it yesterday. She considered this. I'll look at it in the morning. I thought you might say that, he said. I thought about not telling you so we could have one evening without a project, and then I remembered what you said about telling me the moment I notice things. I did say that, she agreed, so I'm telling you. And I will look at it in the morning, she said. And it will take 2 days to address properly, and then it will be done and it will hold, and there will be something else after that. There's always something else, he said. Yes, she said. That's the whole point, Gideon. There is always something else. That's not a problem, that's just the house. That's just what it means to keep living somewhere and paying attention to it. You fix the step, and you find 4 more things, and you fix those, and you find more after that. And the finding and the fixing is not the problem, it's the proof. It's the proof that the house is real and worth keeping, and that you're still here to take care of it. He was quiet for a moment with Lillian in his arms and the evening star fully present above the mountains, and then he said, "What if I told you that this is the first time I've understood that?" She looked at him. In the porch light, his face was all the things it had always been and all the things it had become, and she knew every line of it now, the scar and the jaw and the amber eyes and the expression that meant he was thinking carefully and the expression that meant he had arrived at something true. "Then I'd say," she told him, "that some things take time to understand, and that the understanding is what matters, not the time it took to get there." He shifted Lillian in his arms and put his free arm around Nora and pulled her close, there on their porch in the October evening of their life, and she let herself be pulled, and leaned into his warmth, and felt the solid boards beneath them that she had fixed with her own hands on a morning when she had not known him, and could not have predicted any of this, and she thought that her father had been right about the most important thing, which was that anything worth building was worth building twice in your head before you touched it with your hands, and she had not planned any of this in her head, not even once, and she was beginning to think that was exactly the point. Some things you did not plan. Some things you walked into on a Tuesday morning with a hammer in your hand because a board was loose, and you could not walk past a problem you could solve. And the board led to 4 more things, and the 4 more things led to supper, and supper led to a barn, and a barn led to the kind of honest conversation that built something sturdier than wood. And that something sturdier had turned into this porch, and this man and this daughter in his arms, and their son inside with his wooden fortress, and the east room to be framed before the frost came, and the kitchen beam to be attended to in the morning, and all the mornings after that. Inside the house, Samuel called out something about the fortress that required arbitration, in the imperious way of 5-year-olds everywhere who believe their parents are simply waiting to be of service. Nora started to rise. Gideon said, "I'll go." He stood, carefully, with Lillian in his arms and the ease of a man who had learned to move through his own house without startling anyone, and he went inside, and she heard his voice through the window, low and even, the particular voice he used with Samuel that was gentle without being soft, and she heard Samuel's voice rising in explanation of whatever the injustice was, and she heard Gideon's low reply, and then a sound that was her son laughing, which was the best sound in any room of any house she had ever been in. She sat for a moment longer on the solid porch of their solid house, with the stars coming out above the mountains and Redemption Creek settled into its evening around her, and she breathed the cold, clean air of Colorado and thought about nothing in particular and everything in general, and she was happy. Not the happiness of relief, though there had been relief in it. Not the happiness of arrival, though she had arrived. The happiness of continuance, of a life that kept unfolding, board by board and room by room and person by person, of a house that would always need something attended to, and a family that would always need something attended to, and the extraordinary good fortune of being the kind of person who knew how to pay attention. She went inside, into the lamplight and the warmth, and closed the door behind her, and the house on the south bend of Redemption Creek held them, solid and well-made and repaired with care, and went on holding them through everything that came next.